Hello, and welcome to Climate Talks, Protecting Biodiversity from the Impacts of Climate Change, presented by the German Embassy and Consulates in Canada. I'm Jennifer Hollett. I am the Executive Director of The Walrus. I'm excited to be here, and I'd like to start by acknowledging the land that I'm on in Toronto, Ontario, Toronto. A land acknowledgement helps us recognize history, thinking about how it informs where we are now, but also what changes can be made going forward in a commitment to reconciliation or reconciliation. The Walrus's office are located within the bounds of Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit. This land is also the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. Today, Toronto is home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We are honored to carry on a tradition of storytelling, and we welcome you tuning in at home to reflect on the land that you're on, wherever you're joining us from today. On that note, we want to know where you're joining us from today. So let's check in with the audience. Tell us, where are you tuning in from? Okay, some shout outs. We have audience members registered from all over. Hello, Nanaimo. What's up, Red Deer, Charlottetown, Calgary, Ottawa? Excellent. Thank you again for joining us. We encourage everyone to be a part of the conversation, and you can share your thoughts and reflections on social media. The tags are at Germany in Canada and at The Walrus. In 2022, COP27 recognized that the three existential crises, climate change, pollution, and biodiversity loss, are interconnected and can only be solved together. Working together on solutions to protect biodiversity and tackle climate change is a critical priority for the planet. But how can we connect these issues in a way that really inspire action? Today, we're getting together to discuss the lessons as well as the challenges at this intersection of biodiversity and climate-focused communication here in Canada, as well as Europe. How can journalism and biodiversity-focused communication break down silos and bridge divides? Well, today our speakers in panel will be exploring this. They're going to be sharing transatlantic perspectives on the facts, policy, and action. To start today's conversation, please welcome to the screen Karina Häuslmeier, Deputy Head of Mission, German Embassy, Ottawa. Hello.
Thank you, Jennifer, for the kind introduction. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all. I would like to thank our partner, The Walrus, Jennifer and her team, for hosting this event with us and follow up what she touched on. Why did the German Embassy initiate this climate talk about biodiversity and climate communication? Our aim is to create awareness and inspire action by connecting eminent experts on both sides of the Atlantic with this audience. Thank you very much for devoting your time and joining us today. The biodiversity and climate crises are deeply interconnected, but how exactly? What's the role of healthy ecosystems towards climate neutrality, and how can nature increase our adaptive capacity? And what is actually happening at all these COPs? Communicating about this is key, but what are challenges for communication? What are best practices? Why doesn't a study that predicts that in Europe 1/5 of flora and fauna is threatened with extinction make it to the front page? We hear the news about natural catastrophes in the world and on our doorstep, and we feel with the victims. But do we understand what it means that forests here in Canada, more than half the size of Germany, turned from a carbon sink and natural habitat into a source of carbon? With other fundamental crises happening right now in the world, it's sometimes, unfortunately, just too easy to forget the importance and urgency to protect climate and biodiversity. But if we fail to act, our global security, our future is on the line. The adoption of the Global Biodiversity Framework last year in Montreal at COP15 is key for biodiversity protection. It's a political priority of the German government to advance its implementation. Together with Canada and the UK, we have provided the initial funding to enable the Global Biodiversity Framework Fund to begin its work. We need effective and efficient protection of at least 30% of the land and sea area. Now we have the climate, COP28 approaching. The implementation of the Paris Agreement and the Global Biodiversity Framework need to go hand in hand. To increase ambition, the global stocktake in Dubai will be essential, including clear recommendations. We want to formally decide at COP to at least triple the expansion of renewable energies globally by 2030. We also want to double the rate of improvement in energy efficiency. At the same time, we must now finally agree on the gradual global phase out of fossil fuels. Looking at nature, nature-based solutions, halting deforestation, ecosystem adaptation, and oceans are among the key aspects. And combating the climate crisis will require financial resources. Germany and Canada have cooperated closely to support the industrialized countries' pledge to mobilize 100 billion euros for climate finance. Many of the most vulnerable countries are reaching limits of adaptation, hence setting up the fund for loss and damages and filling it with money is going to be key. I would like to close with a statement our foreign minister made last week to wish us all a fruitful discussion on biodiversity and climate communication. I quote, "Above all, we owe the progress we have made to a joint and active civil society, experts and scientists. If we want to move from a change in awareness to a change in urgency, then we need all partners to work together worldwide." Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I have to say, I'm particularly passionate about this topic because I work in communications. I care about climate, and there's so much to say. So glad that there's a mainstreaming of this issue, but really that we're focusing on this intersection and the importance of communications right now in this moment. All right, next I'd like to welcome Astrid Schomaker, Director for Green Diplomacy and Multilateralism at the European Commission's Directorate General for Environment. Hello.
Hello, everybody.
Over to you.
Hello, everybody. And it's really a pleasure to be with you. Thanks for the opportunity to help set the scene for this webinar. And thank you for organizing a webinar around the links between biodiversity and climate change in the first place. Indeed, silos need to be broken down, and the link between biodiversity and climate change, we believe, is under-recognized and therefore not sufficiently exploited in terms of action taken. The Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services has been very clear that climate change is one of the top 5 drivers of biodiversity loss and may threaten as many as 1 in 6 species at global level. But this is then also a two-way story. So climate change threatens ecosystems, but these ecosystems have also been our strongest ally in combating climate change. Terrestrial and marine ecosystems together have absorbed roughly half of the anthropogenic CO2 emissions. And without this crucial ecosystem service, climate change would have happened even faster. Direct and indirect drivers, including climate change, are pushing ecosystems to the edge, and they then risk turning from being carbon sinks into being carbon sources. And that brings me to my first message. We are today facing a planetary emergency caused by interdependent climate change and biodiversity loss that's been going on for too long. We are in a kind of vicious circle, which can only be addressed successfully in an integrated manner. Which brings me to my second message, and that is that we must turn this vicious circle into a virtuous one, and that we actually know how to do it. It's through accelerating the implementation of 3 types of solutions: technological solutions, nature-based solutions, very important, restoring ecosystems so that they can act as carbon sinks, and societal solutions. And we must take action within this decade. But there, for all of us to see, these solutions are somewhat slow in being deployed. So what needs to be done? That brings me to my third message, and without wanting to sound like a Marxist, the recognition of natural capital as the most critical productive factor in the world economy must guide our actions and policies. This is not only an environmental imperative, but an economic and social one as well. So while we're losing nature at a worrying speed, luckily, organizations like the World Economic Forum now recognize that more than half of global GDP is moderately or highly dependent on nature, and they're engaging in efforts to better account for the value of ecosystem goods and services. And this is what we really need, holistic approaches that integrate the value of nature into decision-making to reduce the ecological footprint of global production and consumption, thereby safeguarding biodiversity and addressing climate change. And that brings me to my fourth and last message. Addressing climate change and biodiversity loss requires a collective effort. Governments, businesses, communities, and individuals all play a crucial role in this endeavor. Through collaboration within and between nations, we can amplify our impact and inspire change on a global scale. And here, let us not forget the indigenous peoples who have been nature custodians for centuries. Their traditional knowledge and sustainable practices can offer valuable insights. So thank you very much for listening to me. And if I can take 15 more seconds, I would just say, maybe in closing, that communicators like you have a key role to play to get the positive but clear narrative into the mainstream, because we need awareness of the emergency and we need to enable people to be part of the solution. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And that's such a great reminder that we're all communicators and the urgency of this moment. Now we're going to kick things off with a presentation of ideas from Jule Reimer, and then we'll move to a moderated panel discussion with experts from Canada and Germany. Jule Reimer is an economist and editor at the German public independent radio station Deutschlandfunk. Jule belongs to the economic desk and specializes in environment, biodiversity, agriculture, raw materials, world trade, and development politics reporting. I have to say, as a storyteller, what range. Jule regularly reports on international summits. This includes the WTO Ministerial Conference and the UN Biodiversity Summit, COP15 in Montreal. Welcome. So glad you can be joining us.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, to allow me to participate in this climate talks. Allow me at the very beginning to have a short look concretely on the 5 main drivers for change, because it might be important to understand what's now happening in Europe, for instance. The drivers are in this order: changes in land and sea use, direct exploitation, overuse, climate change on the 3rd place, pollution and invasion of alien species. And UN summit in Montreal offered some solutions, some goals for 2030. The most important you named is the 30-30 goal. By 2030, almost a third of the land and the sea area should be protected. 1/3 of already degraded ecosystems should be restored to a near natural state. Significant reduction of environmental pollution from all sources like pesticides, chemicals, nutrients, fertilizers too. The recognition of indigenous forest and land management and the elimination of environmental harmful subsidies. They are mounting to $500 billion, and you could spend this money probably better. The summit was the recognition that nature-based solutions are an efficient option to mitigate climate warming and to increase the resilience of nature. This is not evident because in the former summits, for instance, of the climate conference, these 2 aspects were not really linked. And no, you probably know all these, but I would like to mention the examples. The oceans absorb the most of the extra carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. If they wouldn't do this, it would be a lot warmer. The rainfalls of all South America depend on a sound Amazonia rainforest. And I guess with the rainfalls in Canada, might be some similar effects. And wetting of drained peatlands would bind a considerable amount of carbon dioxide, which is a huge topic in Europe because it was an achievement to gain land to produce food by draining these peatlands. So what we have achieved since this last summit. We have a UN agreement, BBNJ, how to protect biodiversity on the high sea, because the high sea actually is an area beyond national jurisdiction. And where do we see kind of like little progress or standstill or regression is, for instance, at the WTO agreement on fisheries subsidies. This is about prohibiting harmful fisheries, illegal subsidizing illegal fishery, and this is far from coming in force. And for instance, the International Seabed Authority is under pressure to allow deep sea mining. In Europe, in the last 2 months, we had really difficult decisions in terms of biodiversity. The nature restoration nature restoration law passed the European Parliament, but was considerably weakened. And just yesterday, the European Parliament rejected a plan to halve the use of pesticides in agriculture. And I talked about the drivers. So this is a really important aspect. And I don't know how you deal with this in Canada, but European Commission pretends to extend the use of glyphosate another 10 years. Interesting thing in this development in Europe is that we expect, for instance, African countries not to exploit their nature and to make money. And we expect them to provide their genetic resources to our industry. Therefore, funding, for instance, was a big thing at the summit in Montreal. Now, looking on the climate COP in Dubai, we have some, I would say, two opposite trends. We have those who push carbon capture and storage as a solution, those who want to phase down only the use of fossil fuels, and we have the other ones, and German government belongs to this part, to these countries, who want to strengthen the idea and the option of nature-based solutions. But this works only if we have rather healthy ecosystems. So I would say, looking what's happening in Europe, is communication is quite difficult, because we are observing that center-right parties and extreme-right parties are winning votes by rejecting laws which are aiming to protect biodiversity. So I don't know if the communication, if we journalists have failed or if politics have failed. One thing about biodiversity, perhaps, biodiversity loss happens insidiously. You don't see it. Pollution, plastic pollution, you can really see. And we start to feel global warming too, because of the damages and the losses, even in industrial countries. So actually, I think I cannot present solutions. We are reporting in our radio a lot. We have a special program on environment, but it seems that populism is very strong on this topic. So thank you very much. I will be happy to listen to some solutions from the panel.
Thank you so much. And your point on not being able to see it, I have to laugh because I have this right here, which is kind of like a capture on my desk of biodiversity and how disconnected but also connected we are to the earth at any time. All right, now for today's panel conversation, we invite you at home to submit your questions via Zoom chat, and we're going to do our best to get to as many of them as possible in the conversation. I also want to note that one of our panelists, environmental journalist Stephen Leahy, will not be able to join us. He's not feeling well, so get better soon, Stephen. To lead today's panel discussion, I am thrilled to introduce our moderator, a friend, Saroja Coelho. Saroja has an incredible career that started in South Korea, where she produced documentaries for CBC, BBC, NPR, and Deutsche Welle. She relocated to Berlin, where she covered environmental issues in Germany, Ukraine, Poland, Bulgaria, and Hungary. And she ran Deutsche Welle's environmental department in the lead up to the Paris climate talks, winning a New York Festivals Award for this work. That's a very big award in radio and audio storytelling. Saroja now hosts shows for CBC, and you can hear her on Mornings, Q, Front Burner, As It Happens, and Day 6. Welcome, Saroja.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. What a lovely introduction. Thank you. Hello, everybody. It is really a pleasure to be with you for this extremely important conversation. We're going to dive right in. I would like to invite our panelists to join us on screen. Joining us from Ottawa, we have Oliver Anderson. He's the Director of Communications to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change Canada. Alongside Oliver, we have joining us from Edmonton, Melina Lebocan-Massimo, who is a co-founder of Indigenous Climate Action and also the founder of Sacred Earth Solar. Melina is Lubicon Cree from Northern Alberta and has worked on environmental and climate justice issues for the past 20 years. She may be a familiar face to you. She's also the host of the TV series Power to the People, and this profiles renewable energy, food security, and eco-housing in Indigenous communities across Canada and around the world. I would also like to have a look across the ocean. From Bremen, we have Professor Hans-Otto Pörtner, who is a physiologist and marine biologist at the Alfred Wegener Institute Helmholtz Center for Polar and Marine Research. Also in Germany, joining us from Berlin is Christian Schwegel, who is the environment and science journalist, and also the managing director of Rift Free Media, which is a nonprofit organization. Thank you, everyone, for being in this conversation. What a collection of intelligent talent and ideas we have around the table. We are going to have time for audience questions, as Jennifer just said. But first, I'd like to give the panelists a moment to tell us a little bit about themselves and their opening thoughts. Christian, perhaps you'd like to begin.
Yeah, thank you, Saroja. It's great to be here, and it's a super important topic we are pursuing here. I've been working on both sides of the environmental debate, the biodiversity and the climate side for almost 30 years now. And actually, it's weird to say that there are sides because it's one planet and it's all interconnected, climate and biodiversity. And I think perhaps it was an original sin by the Earth Summit in '92 to create 2 and actually 3 different conventions, and also then create 2-3 pathways that separate, and also communities, political communities. And we are now trying to unlearn this artificial and very bureaucratic separation, because the 2 subjects are very much interlinked, of course, both as causes and as solutions. And in my journalism and my work in a platform, a cooperative platform of freelance journalists, I'm trying to break through these artificial borders. For me, a guiding topic here is the Anthropocene. That's something I've pursued also in a book project, because the Anthropocene, saying that human impact on Earth is so deep and so global and so long-lasting that it deserves an own geological epoch. It's kind of a framework for thinking about this new Earth we are about to shape. But also I'm trying to get I tried to start concrete journalism projects, for example, on, and that's with philanthropic funding mainly. We've prepared the COP15 journalistically for 2 years at Rift Reporter platform, and we had a project on the hidden sources of clean water, which is very much about wetlands, and then wetlands directly is a climate topic, and so on. So I think it's really important to raise the profile of biodiversity in reporting, and I think that will happen once biodiversity gets a political subject. I mean, climate policy has been a very exotic term. 10 years ago, when I said in editors' discussions, when I said the term climate policy, it was perceived as an exotic word. It's unconceivable now, but it was the case. And now biodiversity policy is still an exotic term. And I would hope that we get beyond this, and that also in journalism, biodiversity policy gets recognized as the most important existential policy field it is. And that's what I'm trying with my journalism.
Thank you so much for those opening thoughts. We're going to go now to Oliver.
Yeah, hi everybody. Oliver Anderson here, and I just want to start by thanking the German Embassy and Walrus for putting on this great panel. I'm really happy to be part of it. And also to acknowledge I'm speaking to you from Ottawa, which is the unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. So I'm the Director of Communications in the Minister of Environment and Climate Change's office, Minister Stephen Guilbeault. And so that means that day to day, my job is usually quite sort of political, and we're dealing with a lot of the sort of pressing political issues of the day. And environmental issues obviously are front and center all the time, I think, with Canadians, and sort of the different angles in which we tackle those continues to evolve. And I think that when we look at where Canadians' interests are, I hear some of the panelists talking about sort of are people tuning out? Why isn't this more of, how can we get biodiversity protection to be more of a mainstream issue? Obviously, we look very closely in government at sort of where people's heads are at in terms of polling results. And just to say that, we obviously are in an era right now where there's a bit of a stress points, I guess, in terms of where affordability, housing concerns are that are sort of top of mind for Canadians. And so a lot of the time also we're trying to find ways in which we can be relevant within that conversation while talking about environmental issues that connect with people and do advance our very ambitious agenda of nature protection and climate action. And it's worth saying, of course, also that environmental concerns from polling that we see there remain obviously very a top priority for a very consistent core of Canadians. And so, it's about sort of expanding that and trying to influence the discussion between beyond that core group, I think, sometimes. And I think one of the things that's most important to recognize also is when you talk about breaking down the silos and how to communicate these things, how do you sort of enter into these conversations with Canadians on a day-to-day basis? We know that climate action can often be a real lightning rod for different established opinions. And, we're always doing our best to try to raise that attention, to offer a positive vision in terms of what climate action can mean for people and why it's in the best interest of the country, obviously. But, overwhelmingly, biodiversity is actually not as politicized. And, polling consistently shows and Canadians' impressions that conserving and caring for nature is extremely important to Canadians. I think Nature Conservancy Canada recently put out results showing upwards of 95% of people saying that conserving and caring for nature is personally important to them. Different polling results would indicate the same. And so I think that biodiversity offers this really interesting entry point where we can again bridge that gap between how protecting biodiversity is also advancing our climate action and ambitions through nature-based climate solutions. So I think that from my experience as well, being in this role for a couple of years, before that I was at agriculture as a communications director. Just to say that what we did in Canada on COP15 in order to try to host that, and what we saw in terms of where it went from being brought together to a place where countries were able to really land an immense agreement on nature protection and biodiversity protection was just a really great starting place, I think, for our conversation nationally within Canada. And I think that the other main thing to recognize is the structures of Canada as a federal nation, as well with a vast networks of indigenous peoples, Inuit, Métis, that there's a lot of cooperation that's required in order to reach these objectives. And I think the fact that nature protection really is an act of reconciliation within Canada, and some of the major strides that I think the government of Canada has been making to sort of turn the tides on how we advance those goals together with Indigenous peoples. Most notably, recently, for example, we did a big nature protection tripartite agreement with the province of British Columbia, as well as over 200 Indigenous groups in British Columbia is a great example. We've a number of other examples I'd like to talk about, but so I think that that's another way where people can understand some of the importance of biodiversity protection and the role that Indigenous peoples are leading to actually advance those goals.
Thank you so much for that, Oliver. We still have two panelists to introduce themselves. Just in the interest of time, I'd just like to ask you to keep your comments a little bit shorter because we want to make sure to get to all these wonderful questions that are coming in. Hans-Otto Pörtner, if I could come to you for a couple of minutes of your opening thoughts.
Yeah, thank you very much. I had the honor to co-chair the first joint effort of IPCC, the World Climate Body, with the World Biodiversity Body, IPBES, for the last COP27, and this report was the first one to really bring the links between climate and biodiversity to the attention of the policymakers. And it's I think it's still a very important issue, and the next COP in Dubai will also have a biodiversity section. This I think is important step forward. The last one in Egypt also had it, but in recent times, when actually the time pressure is now on climate protection and on mitigation, we see that the two things are being played off against each other, and biodiversity is kind of losing out because there's a priority given in policy decisions to fast implementation of renewable energies without paying too much attention or trying to circumvent environmental regulations. And that is certainly an aspect that is challenging, especially here in Germany. We see these trends, and we should be wary of those trends to narrow the view and to silo the views with respect to doing something for climate and doing something for biodiversity. And although certainly the climate impact on biodiversity sort of is still emerging we have the respective projections in our Working Group 2 report of the IPCC, where we deal with the impacts and the vulnerabilities of natural and human systems under climate change. It is very clear that in the future, with unabated climate change, we will see much stronger impacts on biodiversity, and that clearly needs to be prevented. So while I'm saying that we need to keep both issues in mind when talking and when making decisions and bridging between them, it is very clear that biodiversity conservation and also the conversation of the power of biodiversity to help us with long-term climate mitigation requires emissions to be largely reduced. So we should not use nature-based solutions as an excuse. And I know for policymakers that is sometimes very tempting, and we had these discussions here in Europe. Biodiversity conservation and nature-based approaches to carbon storage in natural ecosystems cannot be used as an excuse for not reducing emissions. And this is, I think, a very, very important message that we should repeat and repeat. So policymakers are learning, yes, both are important. Emissions reduction in the short term to keep to the Paris Agreement, keep to 1.5, and having healthy ecosystems, and especially having healthy carbon-rich ecosystems, is a very important approach to long-term climate stabilization, if not to long-term climate cooling, which we would actually need in order to maintain the capacity of ecosystems to be functional and to help us in this regard. So there is a clear difference in terms of timescale. Both issues are existentially needed for the existence of nature by itself, but also for the healthy existence of humankind. And that is something we may go a little bit deeper into during our discussion. Thank you.
Oh, I certainly hope so. Thank you so much for those opening comments. We're going to wrap up our opening comments in just a moment, but perhaps Melina Lobokan, Massimo, you could give us just an opening thought for us before we dive into the conversation itself.
Sure. My name is Melina Miowapin Lobokan Massimo. I am Nihiao Lobokan Cree, which is an Indigenous community that is north of 8 hours north of Calgary. If people are calling in from Canada, it's an Indigenous community that I was born into. My community is Little Buffalo, and my community is actually, was one of the communities in 1988 that raised the alarm bell, seeing the impacts of climate change, pollution, as well as biodiversity loss because of being in the heart of the Alberta tar sands. We are experiencing logging, tar sands, fracking, oil and gas extraction. So we are in a massive extraction zone, one of the largest in the world. And so this is also coalesces with the lungs of Mother Earth. So the northern lungs of Mother Earth, which actually help us keep the climate intact. But unfortunately, there's massive deforestation happening. And so my community in 1988 raised this alarm bell. I was just 7 years old on a blockade with my family. And so this is why I do the work that I do. I dedicated the rest of my life to environmental and climate justice. And so I've worked as a climate and energy campaigner. And again, in 2011, my community experienced a massive oil spill, one of the largest in Alberta's, Canada's history, and seeing the effects on my family was pretty traumatic. And so even though I had already been working full time on climate issues, I decided to also push for a transition and look at what a just transition and energy transition actually means in community on the ground, not just talking about it, but the implementation of it. So like starting the yes to the no. And so that's why I implemented a renewable energy project in my home community, and then went across the country and shot a TV show that's called Power to the People, and went into 26 locations from coast to coast that shows the actual implementation of renewable energy, eco-housing, food security projects that show that this work is actually already happening on the ground. And I think that's the sad thing that I heard a speaker in the beginning about, a failure sometimes with the media, unfortunately, and not just because it's the media's fault. It's also, a lot of things are, I feel like shadow banned, unfortunately, in media. And so we don't actually get to see what's happening on the ground. We have in Canada, just for example, over 2,000 Indigenous-led renewable energy projects and over 200 renewable energy revenue generating large-scale projects. And yet we don't see a lot of this in the news around, and also in policy. We don't see a lot of this in the policy where we see on the ground implementation happening, but we don't see these case studies actually being incorporated into the policy that we really need to see. Just so people know, outside of utilities, Indigenous communities are the largest asset holders of clean energy in this country, but yet we are seen as not those leaders. And so that's a part of creating media around creating power to the people. And also we just launched a multi-year research project called the Just Transition Guide, which profiles these projects, but also goes into policy and grid connection and explaining to communities how to do this transition from communities that have already led this work. So thanks for including me in this conversation. Hi.
Karina, thank you so much. All of you bring so much intelligence to this conversation. Christian, I want to turn to you with a question. As is really expressed here, we have seen a rise in the climate conversation in journalism, from The Guardian to the New York Times to local reporting, but biodiversity journalism is failing to gain that kind of traction. Why do you think the biodiversity crisis is often seen as somehow separate or secondary to the climate crisis? Christian, your microphone isn't on, just so you know.
That really is weird. You'd think that intuitively, actually, we are connected not only to the weather outside and the climate that is the sum of all weather, but intuitively we are connected to everything around us, the food, the water, and so on. So intuitively, you think every journalist would see the importance, but then in newsrooms, when you say biodiversity is a political topic, people will kind of look at you like you're from a foreign planet or something. And I think the way this will change is now through business, and that's also the way it has changed in climate. Climate only became a political topic and is being realized like as a power game topic, and that's the most important thing, because if it's seen as this sort of a flowery topic, then it will stay in the science sections, and I write for science section and love them. But it needs to become the power topic, recognized as the power topic it is. And that will happen through business, I think, as it happened with climate. Climate only became a main topic in news once companies realized that this is for real. This is not just something for corporate social responsibility, but this is something that affects their business. And the same is happening now, starting to happen, fortunately, with biodiversity. So the European Central Bank, for example, just made a study of how businesses are dependent on biodiversity. And there are new reporting rules now on biodiversity by businesses and so on. And I think through that, it will find its way into politics, and from politics, then hopefully into journalism. But we could really be much better in media than we've been. It is a big media failure.
Sam, maybe I could just stay with you for a moment. What are you seeing as the core challenge here? You're talking about how things have advanced and that there's a sense of investment now because we're seeing that there will be an impact on the stability of the world around us. But why is biodiversity failing to lock itself in the imagination of the public? Is it simply too complex and too hard to understand?
Well, there is, I think, a lack of connections being made in media from biodiversity. It's kind of, I mean, I love David Attenborough, but it's kind of seen as this kind of David Attenborough, these interesting animals topic, whereas it's about food, it's about water, it's about medicine, and it's about mental health. So biodiversity in cities is a big factor for mental health. And I think we need to kind of reshape the stories into stories that are kind of all-day life stories, like mental health is, and perhaps write about biodiversity without using the word biodiversity, and make it a tangible day-to-day subject for people who live in cities, and who then better feel that this is something about, this is not Attenborough stuff on TV.
Oliver, I imagine you have something that you'd like to add to this conversation. You act as a communicator and a liaison between ministers of the government and the public. And some of your role, as you described it, is to distill those core ideas about environmental issues and help the public understand them. So as you're listening to this, what would you say is the main challenge when trying to create a discourse, an engaging discourse around biodiversity?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And I mean, I really want to pick up on what Christian was saying about how we make sort of nature apply to people's day-to-day realities as well. And yeah, even the term biodiversity seems kind of distant as well from their lived realities. And I think, there is an appreciation that exists, particularly within Canada, of the importance of people's connection and places that they visit that exist in the natural world. That I think is really, again, a great entry point to showing the importance of protecting nature more broadly speaking, even in the vaster, lesser populated areas in northern Canada. And so, we try to make those links as well by when we're looking at creating arrangements with provincial governments, with municipalities, and that we're highlighting some of those local spaces that people can actually connect with, and to make that broader argument about the importance of protecting nature. The second thing I'd say is for people to sort of to build an awareness about what the core objective that we're driving towards as a country is, and coming out of COP15, it being the success it was in so many different objectives, but the biggest also being the 30 by 30 goal that we set for the world, that we've adopted that in Canada as our goal that we're trying to get all parts of the country on board with. And what does that mean? What does that look like? We're currently about, just under 15% protected land area in Canada. And somewhere similar for protected oceans, that people understand we're in the middle of the largest conservation campaign in the country's history right now, trying to continuously add to our protected areas and spaces so that they get the sense of sort of the big picture as well in terms of what is the core objective and why is that important, because they're protecting 30% of habitats for biodiversity is like the minimum of what science requires of us in order to protect biodiversity throughout Canada. I mean, there's obviously different examples of habitat to habitat, which also require more specific targeted protection, but on a more broad scale, 30% protection is our goal in Canada as well for a reason. So I think for people to sort of understand that the big goal is also important as this sort of more local goal.
I just want to fill folks in case the 30 by 30 goals doesn't mean anything to you. That is a way of describing efforts to conserve 30% of terrestrial and marine habitats by 2030, and is considered a really high point goal for many people in biodiversity work. Oliver, I just want to stay with you for a moment because you're offering us an insight into how we actually have a conversation that matters. I'm wondering what you've seen work and what you have seen fail as you try to communicate priorities set by the government on climate and biodiversity.
Yeah, for sure. It's a great question, and it's something we're always learning about in government in terms of what's working and what's not. And sometimes the ways to measure that can be challenging. Sometimes we measure success in terms of the amount of reach we see from news media, traditional media, new social media, to see sort of how much public interest there is. And I think that some of the things that like are sort of core lessons we know is like, don't focus on the dollar values as much usually for the investments that are required, for expanding conserved areas. Focus more on the stories, focus more on the species, focus more on the things that, again, people really can connect with at a more personal level, and less, and it's just, again, some of the most core principles of sort of removing, there's a lot of bureaucratic sort of structures that have to sort of, that obstacles that you have to overcome in order to sort of realize some of these great conservation goals we have. Once you get to the point of communicating it, that you're able to move past that and be able to, again, connect with people about some of the tangible results, again, not focusing as much on the investments. So I guess that's really more like a practitioner's piece of advice in terms of how to best communicate these things. But that's how I would see the response to that question.
I think that offers a really wonderful segue into Melina's work. Melina, you have been working towards concrete climate solutions, the actual application of them. You've also been present for these conversations for a good 20 years now. What do you think it will take to shift us from a conversation about climate issues that pushes out or pushes to the side biodiversity to one that actually brings us to a solutions-based conversation that works for nature?
Honestly, I do feel like it is a cultural paradigm shift that's needed in Western societies. And just because there's this disconnection, unfortunately, which is different than as an Indigenous person, I was raised in a different perspective than the rest of the country, where we see all of nature around us as a part of us. We call it a sacred hoop. So there's this interconnection, this interdependency, this reciprocity, and with that, a sacred relationship. And that's why you see Indigenous peoples fighting so hard, because they see it as a sacred responsibility to protect biodiversity as a part of us. And my elders have always told me since I was a young one that what you do to the land, you do to yourself. And this is something that Indigenous peoples inherently know. It's a fundamental value. And that's something that I do not see reflected in the dominant culture, unfortunately. And I think that's an unfortunate thing. So when I see people going for a hike or for, to do things that are nature-based, or, whatever way that people want to say that's a relationship, but yet there's not that relationship to protect that park. It's as if it's there, just standing there free alone, but there is that reciprocity. And that's the type of paradigm shift that I think needs to change within a Western colonial culture, and then see that reflected in the media, see that reflected in resources. And so that's what we've tried to do with Power to the People, or the Just Transition Guide, or any of the type of media resources that we put out, to really try to bring those cultural teachings into a world that I feel like desperately needs it.
There's a question in the chat from someone who's tuned in. Edith has asked, what do we need to teach our children to become effective advocates for biodiversity protection?
Honestly, just this is a story that always comes up in my mind, that my dad and my aunties, who all have gone to residential school, my dad was hidden for 10 years from the Indian agent, and that my grandparents could have went to jail for that, but yet he was hidden to be able to give these cultural teachings, to keep these cultural teachings intact, even though they were prohibited by the Indian Act until the 1960s, and kids were taken until 1997. And so these values are so important to us, and that's why we try to spread them and teach them. But I would say for a young person is to like when you're walking through the woods, you know, sometimes you see kids pulling at leaves or pulling at trees and pulling off the leaves. And one of the things that my grandfather would always say is, hey, what did that relative ever do to you? That's a part of us. Don't harm things. So always understanding that we have to, as humans, have a light footprint in this world. And so that's something that we try to teach our young ones and all young people across this country is really that's a sacred relationship that we have, just like a sacred relationship that we have with a parent, that tree that, you know, was raised with us. There's a plant here because I'm at my mom's house. This plant was raised with me. And this, you know, that's a sacred thing. This plant is 30 years old. And so it's the valuing of all living beings, I guess, is really what I want to say.
Lena, thank you so much for that. Hans Otto, I'd like to turn to you for a moment. There's a question from Roger about climate change being obviously a very important issue, but he would like to better understand the crucial nature of assessing and speaking about storytelling, understanding biodiversity as a part of efforts to address climate change.
Yeah, that's a critical question, definitely. And certainly the first thing that needs to be said that all species live in limited temperature ranges, and that temperature is the one big parameter that is enabling life on this planet. And certainly together with water and other enabling living conditions, and making people understand that this is kind of part of the life sustaining functioning of our planet. That's where the oxygen comes from that people breathe, and that is what is purifying our water, that is bringing our food to our tables. I think that's part of appreciating biodiversity. In terms of the links to climate, I mean, the issue of specializing, that organisms specialize on a certain temperature range, and it's a limited temperature range, is an important finding. And that is a statement that's valid for fish in Antarctic waters that would die from heat at 2 degrees plus, to organisms, to animals in the tropics, where they live close to the upper heat limit for animal life in the low 40s, and at the expense of not being cold tolerant at all. It indicates this kind of specialization that is in the genes. So it's also qualifying the limited capacity of organisms to adapt to change. I mean, organisms are on the move currently in response to what we are already seeing in terms of climate change. So animals move and plants move to higher latitudes, move to higher altitudes in order to continue to thrive in what they have inherited as their temperature range. And there isn't much flexibility to change this range through genetic adaptation and even genetic manipulation, what people are thinking about in terms of trying to adapt our crops to future climates. So life is specialized on temperature, and the climate of this planet is amenable to life in all of its components. I think that is what is part of the strongest link between climate and biodiversity. And we are changing this. We are also changing this for our own species, by the way. We are part of nature. We have the same kind of characteristics. And this is what we can see as a cultural background, which was lost in what we call Western civilization, and is so important to bring back, as we've just heard. So I think this is what I would say to this question, and as an answer to this question. Yeah, thank you.
You've painted a picture that I think many of us are still terrified hearing, but it's so important that we continue to talk about impacts. In fact, multiple panelists have spoken about the impact of this polycrisis, something that comes, and we're seeing it happen in the world of health. We're seeing inflation happen at the same time. Food issues come into the climate conversation, as Christian and Oliver both spoke to. Economic issues are profoundly important here. So the weight, the gravity of the situation on our hands as we lose biodiversity on a scale unseen over the past 50 years, the plummet in lives in biodiversity is so massive that we're facing what scientists are calling the largest loss of life on Earth since the dinosaurs. If we accept simply that this is absolutely crucially important, Hans Otto, you regularly have conversations in the press, you give interviews all the time. How do we break down these silos that we appear to be in? We've been speaking a lot about compartmentalization. How do we get scientists, governments, communicators, everybody working together and get out of those silos where we're simply echoing these thoughts back and forth to each other?
Yeah, that's a critical part of the conversation, because I mean, that is the biggest hurdle we need to be overcoming, is the inertia in our system, the inertia in our thinking, also on an individual basis. And how do we best do this? I mean, we ourselves in our lives silo what we are doing in certain parts of our lives. It's not that sort of climate mitigation is on our mind all the time in terms of what we are doing, or that biodiversity conservation is. And that is part of the training that we need to go through. And certainly the siloed thinking is very strong in it's enshrined in our bureaucracies, where people sit in their offices specializing on certain issues that need to be addressed and need to be solved, and them talking to their neighboring bureaucrats in terms of who are maybe responsible, one of them being responsible for setting aside an area for setting up solar panels, and maybe the next ministry is responsible for nature conversation. How do we make these people talk to each other and make sure that they are not forgetting that whatever they do, and they will touch the other person's area? I mean, that's how it starts. In Germany, we've had an attempt with the formation of this government to spread responsibility across ministries. So the climate is now with the foreign ministry, and the biodiversity is with the environmental ministry, and the nature-based solutions are also with the environmental ministry. So there is some networking happening, but it's only a start, and there are always barriers and borders to be overcome. And the communication through media, and the media linking these aspects, bringing it to the people, and us, I think, bringing these topics to the education system, and that's also a policy decision. Making these mainstream topics in the education, at school and in university, is very important. And that's also part of what Melina was referring to. We need to teach the next generation. We need to, if we teach the children, they go home, and if they see their parents living their old mode of life in terms of not paying attention to these issues, by having high levels of meat consumption, high levels of milk consumption, and so forth, the children will challenge the parents. And I think this is one of the main tools of rapid transformation in our mentality to address these crises.
Hans Otto, thank you for that. So education clearly being seen as one of the real options on the table. And I guess as communicators, we see ourselves as the continuing adult education for many of the stories that we are telling to people who may be out of the school system, but still open to learning. I want to talk about an issue that's come up in several questions. Christopher has asked whether or not the crisis in biodiversity has a branding problem. Why aren't we calling it ecosystem collapse, for example? And as an addition to that, Fiona has asked directly to Melina about whether or not the term planetary health would be one that would help us better understand the relationships that she's beginning to describe. So language clearly being one of the places that possibly in the world of communication, we have opportunities to highlight the urgency here. I'd like to throw this open, beginning with Melina, but I imagine many of the communicators around the table here would like to speak to this question of language and the way that we communicate.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing. It's like this thing between action and the thing between climate grief that people are experiencing, where people are shutting down, becoming apathetic, becoming fatalistic, and we want to drive people to action. But we also need to be honest with people. And I feel like there's this sanitization of language in our vocabulary around the climate crisis, around biodiversity, around ecological collapse. And I think we just need to be honest with people. And I feel like, 15 years ago when we were like, there was many of us, scientists, climate, folks that were working on climate issues, as well as Indigenous peoples, like raising the alarm bell like they had been previously. We were gaslit. We were literally gaslit for talking about these issues publicly, nationally, even here in this country. And so I feel like we need to have an allowance of allowing people to be able to really take in that information. Like you said, we're educating adults, so we shouldn't have to sanitize language around ecological collapse and biodiversity collapse, because we need to actually be honest with people where things are really at. And I think that's the thing. When I'm back home in the tar sands, like, I'm seeing biological collapse. I'm seeing it on the ground. It's not something that we're just talking about that is far away. It is here. It is now. And I think that's the thing that's a bit frustrating when we, like, it does feel like a bit of a shadow ban. We even see on social media where you use the word climate in your shadow banned. And so I think this is a really unfortunate thing right now, because we actually need to have these robust dialogues and conversations around climate and where we're really at. And yet a lot of times it's happening on panels like this, and we're not able to really have them even on social media or in mainstream media at that.
That is so fascinating, Melina. What you're really bringing out there is that incredible balance between telling people what is urgent and not getting them to a place where they shut down. And climate grief, of course, you're talking about all the grief and the shame that makes people turn away. I want to turn to both Christian and to Oliver. I imagine you have a lot to say about this. First, I'll begin with Christian. Just make sure your mic is on. Don't keep all your ideas to yourself.
Yeah. No, I fully agree. And Melina you're really offering what's needed here. And the language, I've just been to Paris, where biodiversity seems to be a totally hip word. And in the city parks, they've created there are signs saying biodiversity. I can say for Germany, that's not the case. The word hasn't caught on. And I think, as Melina said, it's then probably better to use words that are actually more descriptive of what's happening, and also formats. In news reporting, you have the everyday, or actually hourly, you have like a stock market report, and you have a weather report. Why don't we have a nature or life report where population trends are shown, where extreme events like the tar sands are shown, like a equivalent to a company collapse, and this should be something that is integrated in programming as a daily activity, and make people aware that population trends in species are as important as stock market trends. It's the same kind of curves, but in biodiversity, most of the curves are going down. So we are in a biodiversity or in a life recession. And again, this is, a vocabulary that we as journalists really need to work on.
I just want to let everybody know we are now we're just past 1 o'clock. We've decided to tack on another few minutes. We'll be in this space until 1:20 if people want to stick around. So obviously this conversation will not stay in a 1 hour space. Oliver, I'd like to come to you because you also have a very delicate balance. In addition to trying to find language that won't make people shut down, you're also looking at describing governmental priorities and keeping language inclusive, as well as the political minefields that can open up when you say the wrong thing at the wrong time. I'd be so interested in where what you're seeing as opportunities around language, opportunities around the way that we're thinking about and labeling this crisis, how things have changed over the course of your career.
Yeah, no, thanks so much. I think that one of the biggest perceptions I have on it is for example, we have a youth council at Environment Climate Change Canada, who we speak to relatively regularly. And, they have broader networks of youth that they're also in touch with. And just again, the overwhelming sense, I guess, of anxiety, eco-anxiety that youth are experiencing now, I believe that it is actually going to continue to emerge as a really dominant driver for the shape of this conversation in the future. And something that I couldn't agree more with what Melina is saying. And what you were just again prefacing this question in terms of the absolutely delicate balance to raise those alarms which we need to do, and government has lots of information, lots of data, lots of information that we need to be able to be proactively sharing to demonstrate the scale of the issue. And then at the same time, offering those tangible solutions right at that same time, so we can show communities of people, youth, where and how they can be mobilized, how they can be engaged, what is the plan. I would fear for a future in where these conversations are not going to be really proactively approached by political leaders. And the level of eco-anxiety, for example, would mount, and yet it's just not going to be addressed sufficiently by those in government. And so, we have been, furiously developing a range of different major sort of policies to cut emissions, to deal with climate adaptations, biodiversity strategies, a number of different elements on reconciliation, for example, that we can help to ensure Indigenous peoples are also taking that leadership role, whether it is, for example, with energy production. I think you were mentioning that before, Melina, that we've got some great examples of that, and interested to hear your perspectives there. So it's just a question of really making sure that all the information, the data, and the knowledge about the scale of the crisis is presented, but at the same time, we're able to offer really a good, tangible, concrete plan that, I can just say again, I think we have the largest mandate letter in government in Environment and Climate Change Canada. And so there's a lot that's underway, and a lot that's really, I think, forcing some of these issues to better places, but also sort of, we're at quite a critical point within the political discourse in Canada, I would suggest as well.
This is all really, really interesting. I don't know if anybody watches The Nature of Things, but I've been watching that show since I was a child. And certainly the way that it was spoken about climate change when I was a child versus the way that show will be very direct and on the nose, as Melina says, really showing the incredible importance of having this conversation. The urgency has absolutely risen over the trajectory of that show. I want to turn to, and there were a lot of questions from the public about implementation, the actual practical application that we are seeing. And Melina, maybe I'll come to you first. You have seen so many projects across Canada. The storytelling around those projects is quite a success story, getting people excited about what can actually practically be done. What do you see as a lesson that we can draw as we try to really re-examine placing biodiversity at the center of our conversation? What do you see as the really successful ways that you, or things that you see have really worked as you've had that conversation with the public?
Yeah, well, what I've seen in community, so communities, I visited communities from coast to coast. It's called Power to the People. If folks want to watch it, you can watch it on the Weather Network. And it's 13 episodes. We went to 26 locations, and we profiled a variety of different transition technologies, not just wind and solar, which we also did profile those as well, different scales, district energy, like small scale biomass, off-grid, on-grid systems. So we profiled so many in eco-housing, food security. So I would definitely recommend that. What we did was we showed the problem in the community, and they identified it themselves. There's community leaders within the community. It's implemented from the bottom up within community across the country in multiple jurisdiction. So I think what is important is that no matter where you are, you can still build something. And that's the thing, is that communities superseded. And even if it was, they had to deal with certain jurisdictions to connect to grid, to deal with certain governments to get that, like 47 wind turbines, say, for example, in the Gaspé, where we profiled 3 Mi'kmaq communities that came together. And so they're doing cultural assessments as well as environmental assessments. So they're protecting biodiversity while they're doing the implementation as well. They're engaging community while they're doing the implementation as well. So there's a variety of different ways that it's so important to implement, because what we don't want to see within why we call it a just transition or an energy transition, is we don't want to see the same systems of harm replicated from the previous fossil fuel regime into the new energy transition, because then I think we're just kind of at the same place again. We're still seeing the impact on communities. We're still seeing an impact on biodiversity. So we want to see these this changed in a way where communities are engaged, communities are owners, communities are leaders. And so communities are more resilient and robust in the face of climate change, because if it's always out of the hands in another utility utility, another big energy developer, that the communities aren't a part of that, then they're not going to be resilient. And so I think that's the thing that we really wanted to profile and empower the people, was to show that communities knew the problems, but had the solutions. And I think that's what we really wanted to profile, because there's so many issues within, every single community, but communities came together and they rose to the occasion.
Hans Otto, I'd like to come to you for a moment, because the biodiversity conversation has happened largely, at least in my career, it's definitely taken place, speaking largely about land-based life forms, about the life forms that we engage with because we are in competition for land, or because we are creating food in a way that affects biodiversity, or we're logging in a way that affects biodiversity. But you have been a big part of the conversation about what's happening in our oceans, as you've already spoken to some degree in this conversation. Do you see lessons that we can learn about the conversation on biodiversity on the land that will help us as we turn to the oceans, where we still have so many opportunities to protect life, and to be more responsible in our engagement with natural resources?
Yeah, that's a critical question, because that is on the one side another example for a silo. There's a terrestrial community talking about nature conservation, and there is a marine community talking about nature conservation and marine protected areas. And when we did our report, it was becoming very clear to me that these issues are connected, they are related in a way. The approach is needed to protect biodiversity in the ocean and on land, and to restore in natural ecosystems can follow similar principles. So we have developed what we call a mosaic approach, where we say that protected areas need to be placed in a way that they can be connected through corridors, and that they can enrich neighboring areas that are more intensively used by humans. They can enrich it with biodiversity. There are examples in the marine realm where protected areas provide some of their richness of the fish stocks to the neighboring areas, where the fishing results are increasing. And a similar mentality could be used in the terrestrial realm. Once we give up on using toxins and pesticides and things like that to control the agriculture system, we could have a more ecological approach where we use the richness of healthy biodiversity for the production of our food. And I think these are concepts and approaches that need to be discussed further. And maybe to add to what you've asked before, you used planetary health as a term. And that is actually a concept that we have also included into our assessment, because I think talking about health is a very important lever for people to understand what is at stake, because there's a clear connection between human health, the health of the nature of the natural environment around humans, healthy ecosystems, and a healthy planet, and how we can enable that and bring that forward with our lifestyles, with respecting nature and respecting areas to be protected, not to penetrate the last ecosystems on the planet and mobilize the last viruses that may bring to us the next pandemic. I think these can also be important strings of motivation to enforce nature protection, and finally to bring about planetary health, where the issues of climate and biodiversity are considered together.
Thank you very much for that, Hans Otto. Christian, I'm seeing you nodding in quite a few places there, particularly around as we revisit the idea of silos and lessons learned as we move forward. Did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think the ocean is a really good example of, again, I mean, that's 70% of the surface and 95 or 99% of the kind of living space on Earth. People don't have most people who don't live in marine communities don't really have a real connection except for holidays or so. But I mean, what Hans Otto described, this deep connection of the ocean to the climate system, is just one example that actually you cannot understand the climate without biodiversity. And I'd say understanding biodiversity is a condition for understanding climate in the public more deeply. The whole climate debate has been really superficial so far about like change a little thing here and there, but it's really that only if our publics understand the cycles, the connections, the phenomena in the biosphere, they will really appreciate and really understand what's going on about climate. So perhaps biodiversity journalism then also is a condition for a prerequisite for a successful climate journalism, and that should definitely be spread in the environmental journalism scene.
What I am really hearing around this table is that the situation is incredibly urgent, that times are upon us for immediate action, that the value of action now feels very important. We have a question from Jen, which is, what is the main thing I can do? And she wants to just or they want to open this conversation as wide as they can to each of you. I'm going to ask you to narrow it a little, and Jen, I hope you're okay with that, to specifically focus on the conversation around diversity, because we have a lot of storytellers gathered in this space with us in an opportunity. We have 4 minutes left, so that sort of leaves you with about a minute each to answer the question, what is the main thing when it comes to this conversation on biodiversity and amplifying the urgency here? What can I do? Melina, I'm going to come to you first.
Oh boy. Okay. Well, what I do say to people is that every single person is needed and every person's skill set is valuable. So it doesn't matter what you are and how do you come to the table. If you are an accountant, if you are an electrician, if you are a policymaker, it doesn't matter what you are. Each person is needed in the fight of climate change and also the protection of biodiversity. So I would just leave it as that. And then also bringing in, of course, many of the voices that have been marginalized and structurally oppressed, bringing those voices in also to the forefront to include, to have the diversity, equity, inclusion in the conversation. So we're ensuring that communities that have faced the brunt of environmental and climate and degradation from the fossil fuel regime, that we're actually upholding those people, workers and communities to transition as well alongside the rest of society.
Melina, thank you so much. Oliver, I'm going to come to you next. What can I do when it comes to this conversation on biodiversity?
I'm going to offer you a very political response to that, which is, get engaged and, make your voice heard. If this is something that you care about, make it heard to your friends, and certainly don't be afraid to pressure government. Governments respond to political pressure. Apathy is not what's going to solve the issue. We need to mobilize voices. In Canada, that's at the federal level, but it's just as much also at the provincial level as well. I think that there's a lot that can be done to mobilize political support, across different jurisdictional levels, which is really actually, I think, going to be something that's going to be a big difference maker in this conversation.
Thank you so much. Hans Otto, if I could come to you, what is it that I can do if I'm a storyteller, if I have access to these platforms, these channels towards the public? What can I do when it comes to this conversation of biodiversity?
Yeah, well, the first thing is I would fully agree with what Oliver said in terms of generating pressure for policymakers. They need to be made aware that there is a limited time window to secure a livable future on the planet for all. And they need to really mobilize everything they can in that direction, increasing the exploration and also mobilization of fossil fuels, like is discussed in some governments, is just telling us some people haven't got it, although they are in a responsible position. I think they need to change their mentality. And then for every person on the planet, I would say, mobilize the low-hanging fruit that you can mobilize in your immediate environment, in your behavior, that will reduce your emissions, that will allow nature to thrive in terms of how you do your gardening and how do you actually push your local community to protect the last nature that may still be existing in some corners. I think the low-hanging fruit in terms of climate and biodiversity is there. It's in policy, it's the false subsidies in terms of that are damaging to nature and that are actually mobilizing fossil fuels that we should not use anymore. I think that is where it starts in policy, and in our daily life, it's about you should look where you live, what you can do in terms of reducing emissions, adding solar panels to your house, drive an electric vehicle, and do your heating with a heat pump. That would be immediate changes you can do if you have the money to invest, and you should push your policymakers that your public system is really developed in a way, that the blue and green spaces in your environment become healthy and healthy ecosystems. All of this, it's a complex issue. There's nothing really one recipe for everything, but we need to just think about the connection between the different things.
Thank you so much. Christian, I'm going to give you the closing word on what it is that we can do.
Well, I think for journalists, it's important that science and environment journalists break into the political and the economy sections and the business sections, because this is an economic topic. And that is super important, and they should reflect why the World Economic Forum has the biodiversity as the number 1, number 2, and number 3 top risk for the next decade in its assessment of global risks. And on a personal level, I think we all should work on this has been also in the chat, a topic in the chat, we should all work on our ecological intuition. In my talks, I say that the world I wish for is that people, when they take a shower in the morning, they think not only about their plans for the day, but about the wetlands where the water comes from. And when they fill their tank, they think about the plants and animals that have gone into that, into the diesel or whatever it is, and also the ecosystems they were destroyed for it. And if they hear a bird, let it happen and see feel how soothing it is, how good nature can feel for you. And so ecological intuition, I think, is a very important thing to kind of exercise. And that's on a personal level, that's my wish for what should happen.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you. This has been such an intelligent and imaginative conversation. We could speak for so much longer, and very sadly, we have finally reached the end of this also extended conversation. You won't be able to hear the applause of everybody gathered for this conversation, but I know that it is felt strongly. Thank you so much, Oliver Anderson, Melina Lebokan-Massimo, Professor Hans-Otto Pörtner, and Christian Schwegel. I would also like to thank the people who opened this conversation for us, Jule Reimer for your insights, Karina Häuslmeier, and Astrid Schomaker. I'd also like to thank the German Embassy and Consulates in Canada for making this conversation at all possible. What an important exchange we've had today. And thank you to everybody who gathered in this space to have this conversation with us. Have a wonderful, thoughtful day after this conversation.